He highly arrogantly called their unborn baby a highly toxic liability and a pathetic threat, completely to his massive, multi-billion-dollar IPO. He violently ordered her to aggressively terminate the pregnancy and ruthlessly erase the innocent child. She frantically fled completely into the freezing depths entirely of Siberia to fiercely protect her son. Exactly 6 agonizing years significantly later, the highly toxic CEO horrifyingly discovers that the exact woman he violently discarded is exactly now the brilliant mastermind actively destroying his massive empire, and that his absolute own, highly powerful billionaire father has literally just made her innocent son the absolute sole heir entirely to absolutely everything. Welcome back to the channel, my beautiful family. If you fiercely believe that absolute karma always successfully collects its highly massive debts, and you absolutely love highly explosive stories of ultimate revenge and pure shit, you absolutely must hear this incredible story. Please smash that like button, subscribe to our channel, and type boomerang in the comments below to strongly support absolute justice. Let's get directly into the Siberian escape. The toxic ultimatum. Irina Kolmskaya had absolutely never, ever highly actively imagined that her highly perfect, beautiful life could completely, violently shatter entirely in exactly one single, terrifying night. But the absolute precise moment that Daniil Belov confidently entered their highly luxurious, multi-million-dollar penthouse entirely in the massive Federation Tower, flawlessly overlooking the highly bright night skyline entirely of massive Moscow. She profoundly felt the solid floor completely, violently drop completely out from entirely beneath her weak feet. The highly brilliant lights entirely of the massive capital brilliantly sparkled completely behind his broad back, exactly like highly freezing, sharp shards entirely of broken glass. And the heavy air violently became incredibly sharp, highly heavy, a highly terrifying warning that absolutely something was highly catastrophically wrong. She had aggressively spent the absolute entire, highly anxious day meticulously rehearsing exactly how she would beautifully, explicitly tell him, highly pathetically hoping he would smile radiantly, perhaps highly lovingly pull her completely close directly to him, exactly as he beautifully did, entirely in their highly magical, absolute first months, completely together. Instead, he literally barely actively glanced entirely at her. He aggressively loosened his highly expensive silk tie, highly carelessly, arrogantly tossed his highly expensive Mont Blanc pen completely onto the polished marble counter, and rapidly checked his expensive phone, exactly as if she absolutely was not even actively completely there. She violently swallowed incredibly hard, her soft hands violently trembling exactly as she incredibly slowly extended a highly small, pristine white envelope flawlessly containing the highly official medical test results. Danya, I am officially heavily pregnant for exactly one highly brief, microscopic instant. His handsome expression beautifully softened, exactly like a highly fleeting, pathetic shadow entirely of the true man she had exactly once fiercely loved. But then, it completely, violently vanished. His sharp jaw aggressively clenched, his piercing eyes completely turned to freezing ice, and the highly heavy, suffocating silence that violently followed was so incredibly, agonizingly long that it physically felt exactly as if the absolute entire massive city had completely stopped actively breathing. Irina, he finally stated, his deep voice incredibly low, highly clipped, incredibly transactional. Exactly as if he were highly calmly actively discussing highly catastrophic quarterly corporate losses, and absolutely not their biological child. Do you profoundly understand exactly what this explicitly means right exactly now? Completely before the highly massive IPO, completely before the highly stressful press tours, completely before absolutely everything I have brutally built has finally become highly, absolutely attainable. Her soft lips slightly parted. Danya, it is officially our beautiful child. But he cowardly, highly toxically stepped completely back, exactly as if the heavy word child highly lethally poisoned the heavy air. This is the absolute worst, highly possible massive timing. The highly elite investors absolutely do not fiercely want to vividly see a highly distracted, pathetic CEO completely with a highly pregnant, emotional wife. Do you genuinely, arrogantly think they will highly, blindly trust me to successfully direct a multi-billion-dollar massive company exactly if they vividly see highly pathetic chaos entirely in my highly personal life? Chaos. Exactly that is exactly what he highly cruelly called their beautiful child. Irina physically felt her fragile chest violently tighten, but desperately attempted to flawlessly remain highly calm. I simply genuinely thought, you absolutely did not actively think. He violently, sharply cut her completely off. You absolutely should have been significantly more incredibly careful. Her heavy breath violently caught completely in her dry throat. So, this was completely, 100% her absolute fault. He absolutely did not actively answer. He absolutely didn't desperately need to. The massive, crushing weight entirely of his highly toxic disappointment completely, violently crushed the massive room. The luxury penthouse highly suddenly physically felt way too incredibly massive. Way too incredibly freezing cold. Way too incredibly empty entirely for exactly the two entirely of them. Daniil paced highly frantically back and completely forth, highly toxically muttering entirely to his absolute own self entirely about elite shareholders, pristine image, aggressive reporters, highly critical timing. Absolutely, not exactly once did he explicitly say, baby. Absolutely not exactly once did he explicitly say, US. And exactly as she stood perfectly there, completely, with her soft arms, highly protectively wrapped entirely around her flat belly, a highly small, highly protective gesture that she didn't absolutely even actively realize she was actively doing. She profoundly felt absolutely something highly fundamental, completely, violently, break entirely inside her. Then, Daniil completely stopped. He intensely looked directly at her completely with highly freezing finality, and explicitly pronounced exactly 7 highly heavy words that violently carved themselves completely into her fragile bones. You actively know exactly what you absolutely must highly do. Irina completely, utterly froze. Absolutely zero pure warmth. Absolutely zero pathetic hesitation. Absolutely zero humanity. Only a highly strict, absolute order. Only a highly toxic expectation. Only a highly arrogant man explicitly telling a highly terrified woman to violently, ruthlessly erase an innocent life entirely so he absolutely wouldn't actively have to bravely face a highly annoying newspaper headline. Danya, please, she whispered incredibly softly, her beautiful voice violently breaking. "Do absolutely not aggressively force me to fiercely choose." He smoothly turned completely away, aggressively tightening his expensive tie completely again, exactly as if actively preparing entirely for a massive war. "I am absolutely not aggressively forcing you to fiercely choose, Irina. I am highly explicitly voicing completely to you the absolute only highly acceptable massive solution." The massive room violently spun. Her frantic heartbeat loudly roared entirely in her terrified ears, and entirely for the absolute first time. She profoundly realized that this absolutely was not the exact man she had fiercely loved. This was absolutely someone completely, utterly different. Absolutely someone highly, incredibly dangerous. And she possessed absolutely zero microscopic idea that this highly terrifying night was absolutely only the highly explosive beginning entirely of an absolute nightmare. Daniil demanded Irina terminate her pregnancy for his IPO. What is the most selfish thing you've ever seen someone do for their career? Tell us below. The PR nightmare. The absolute very next highly early morning. Entirely while massive Moscow was absolutely still, actively stretching completely after highly heavy sleep, completely under a highly gray, freezing sky. Daniil Belov sat highly arrogantly, entirely in the highly massive glass boardroom entirely of Belov Capital. The massive room majestically towered incredibly high, completely above the massive city. The highly beautiful skyline brilliantly sparkled completely below him, exactly like highly expensive trophies that he absolutely already arrogantly believed, completely, legally belonged entirely to him. His highly elite top managers had eagerly gathered completely around the highly sleek imported marble table. But his highly brilliant thoughts were absolutely not entirely on the highly packed agenda. They were completely entirely on Irina, entirely on the highly inconvenient pregnancy, entirely on the highly toxic threat that he arrogantly believed she had violently become. He absolutely did not vividly see an innocent child. He highly maliciously saw a highly toxic liability. Victoria Krestovskaya, his highly impeccably stylish elite director of communications, confidently entered highly fashionably late, her highly expensive stilettos loudly clacking completely on the polished floor. She sat heavily perfectly right directly next, completely to him, completely, with the highly easy, absolute grace, entirely of a highly terrifying person who profoundly knows the absolute extent entirely of her massive influence. Her highly expensive perfume smoothly floated directly toward him, highly subtle, but incredibly calculating. "You visually look incredibly tense," she whispered incredibly softly, intensely looking directly at him completely with that highly familiar toxic mixture entirely of massive curiosity and blinding ambition. Daniil aggressively slid a highly thick folder completely toward her. Highly complex financial projections entirely for the highly anticipated IPO. But she highly astutely noticed exactly how his sharp jaw was violently clenched, exactly how his long fingers highly aggressively drummed completely on the polished table. Absolutely something was highly catastrophically wrong. "What exactly violently happened?" she murmured softly. He incredibly slowly exhaled. "A highly complex situation completely at home." "Will it highly negatively affect the massive roadshow?" she asked completely immediately. Absolutely not even actively bothering to highly pathetically hide her highly corporate concern entirely for the massive company. and highly possibly entirely for her absolute own elite ascension completely within it. Danielle violently hesitated entirely for a highly microscopic fraction, entirely of a second, significantly longer than absolutely necessary. Victoria's piercing eyes violently sharpened. "Is it officially her? Irina?" He absolutely did not actively answer. He absolutely didn't desperately need to. Victoria slightly, smoothly leaned completely back, intensely evaluating him exactly the highly specific way a highly elite strategist meticulously evaluates a highly bloody battlefield. The highly elite investors are absolutely already incredibly nervous, she stated incredibly softly. Absolutely any highly unexpected, massive distraction could violently damage the highly critical valuation. Highly, especially, absolutely something highly domestic. Danielle shot her a highly lethal warning glare. "It is completely, utterly under absolute control. It highly apparently absolutely does not visually look exactly like it," she replied highly smoothly. What exactly did she highly stupidly do? Danielle's deep voice violently dropped. "She is heavily pregnant." Victoria rapidly blinked exactly once. Exactly twice. Then her bright lips beautifully curved completely into a highly small, perfectly polished, toxic smile. The exact kind that absolutely did not successfully reach her freezing eyes. "Well," she stated, "that is incredibly inconvenient." Inconvenient. The exact same, highly toxic, heavy word he had absolutely been actively using entirely in his brilliant mind, the absolute entire, agonizing night. He intensely looked directly at the massive city completely outside the large window, at exactly how the highly bright morning sun aggressively struck the highly towering steel buildings, flawlessly casting highly incredibly long, dark shadows. The highly inconvenient pregnancy could completely, violently shatter the highly impeccable, elite image he had so incredibly, meticulously created. The highly unstoppable visionary, a highly terrifying man, way too incredibly focused, way too incredibly disciplined, way too incredibly pure, entirely to highly pathetically allow highly messy personal drama to absolutely ever touch him. The highly elite investors absolutely do not fiercely want a highly pathetic family man right exactly now. Victoria aggressively continued, meticulously flipping completely through the highly complex financial reports. They highly desperately need absolute strength, absolutely someone completely, utterly untouchable. "I completely know," Danielle muttered highly toxically. "And a highly emotional pregnant wife?" She incredibly slowly shook her beautiful head. "It highly dangerously complicates the highly perfect story we have successfully built. The highly perfect story we have successfully built." Danielle highly astutely noticed her highly specific choice entirely of heavy words. Victoria smoothly leaned significantly closer, her beautiful voice exactly low enough entirely so that absolutely no one, completely else, could clearly hear. "If you desperately need to highly rapidly fix the massive situation, exactly now. It's the absolute perfect time, completely before the highly toxic press maliciously sniffs it completely out. Completely before the massive board of directors aggressively begins to actively ask highly intrusive questions." Danielle intensely looked directly at her. She fiercely held his piercing gaze completely without violently blinking. "It is officially your highly personal decision," she aggressively added. "But exactly if you desperately want the highly massive IPO to seamlessly pass completely cleanly, you absolutely cannot highly afford highly toxic surprises. Absolutely not completely from her. A highly freezing, absolute certainty violently settled completely into Daniel's strong bones. He had aggressively spent an entire agonizing decade highly meticulously building a massive empire. He would absolutely not highly pathetically allow Irina or a highly pathetic child to violently put it completely at massive risk. When the highly important meeting officially ended, Victoria highly lightly touched his strong arm. "Aggressively deal completely with it highly rapidly," she whispered incredibly softly. "Entirely for the absolute sake, entirely of absolutely all, entirely of US." He absolutely did not violently pull completely away. He absolutely did not highly aggressively object. Instead, he confidently walked completely out entirely of the massive boardroom, absolutely already meticulously developing his highly next, massive strategic move, absolutely already highly carefully preparing the highly heavy words he would aggressively use to violently corner Irina, absolutely already highly toxically transforming her completely into a highly pathetic problem that desperately needed to absolutely be efficiently eliminated. Exactly what he absolutely did not completely know. Exactly what he absolutely could not highly possibly know was that this highly toxic decision would absolutely not fiercely protect his massive empire. It would completely, violently destroy it. And the absolute first highly massive crack entirely in his highly perfect, elite world was actively about to violently appear exactly on this highly specific, very day. The cold clinic, the highly exclusive restaurant that Daniel had highly carefully selected exactly that evening, was exactly one entirely of those highly dark, incredibly expensive places, perfectly on the highly elite patriarch ponds. Exactly where the highly soft lighting is exactly soft enough to flawlessly hide pathetic aging. And the highly exorbitant prices are exactly high enough to highly aggressively keep completely normal pathetic people completely out. Irina sat peacefully entirely at a highly small, quiet corner table, her soft fingers anxiously tracing the highly cold rim entirely of her water glass, exactly while she highly patiently waited. The highly soft hum entirely of elite conversations and the highly elegant clinking entirely of expensive silverware, highly possibly, could have beautifully calmed her entirely on absolutely any completely other night. But exactly today, her heavy stomach was violently twisted completely with pure, unadulterated terror. When Daniel finally confidently arrived, he absolutely did not lovingly kiss her exactly upon greeting. He absolutely did not gently touch her soft hand. He absolutely didn't even politely ask exactly how she actively was. He simply smoothly slid completely into the highly expensive seat, directly opposite entirely from her, and smoothly opened the massive menu. Exactly as if it were absolutely just another highly boring, highly routine corporate business dinner, Irina aggressively forced completely herself to bravely speak. "Danya, we absolutely did not successfully finish the highly important conversation completely last night. I desperately need you to explicitly tell me exactly what you truly, genuinely, actively feel." He highly slowly lowered the expensive menu exactly a highly microscopic fraction, entirely of an inch. "Exactly what I actively feel," he stated highly coldly, "is highly massive disappointment." The heavy words violently pierced her completely, straight through. He smoothly leaned completely forward, his massive elbows perfectly on the small table, his deep voice incredibly freezing cold, but highly, flawlessly controlled. You profoundly knew exactly how incredibly, massively important this exact year is entirely for me. Entirely for the massive company. Entirely for the massive IPO. And you absolutely still highly foolishly allowed exactly this to violently happen. Irina rapidly blinked, completely, utterly stunned. Allowed? Danya, I absolutely did not highly actively do exactly this completely alone. And exactly this absolutely is not absolutely something entirely for which you can highly maliciously blame me. It is officially our beautiful child. The elite waiter smoothly approached, but Daniil highly aggressively sent him completely away, completely, with a highly short, dismissive wave entirely of his massive hand. His piercing eyes violently remained completely, permanently, glued directly to her. Irina, he stated, a highly pathetic child right exactly now will completely, violently destroy absolutely everything. The highly elite investors absolutely do not highly blindly trust highly toxic instability. They desperately need a highly elite CEO completely with a highly flawless, pristine image, highly disciplined, highly focused, completely unencumbered. His sharp jaw violently clenched. A highly emotional pregnant wife aggressively sends the completely, utterly wrong, highly toxic signal. Her beautiful voice violently trembled. What exact specific signal? That you are officially human? That I am completely distracted, he violently barked. That I absolutely cannot highly successfully control my absolute own highly personal life. That my highly critical judgment is completely, fatally compromised. Irina physically felt hot tears, aggressively rising completely to the highly fragile edges entirely of her beautiful eyes. But she fiercely refused to highly generously allow them to violently fall. This is absolutely not a highly pathetic PR problem, Daniil. This is an innocent child. Absolute, pure life. He highly loudly exhaled. Completely, highly irritated entirely, that she absolutely did not completely understand. Then, he smoothly reached completely into the highly deep, inside pocket entirely of his bespoke jacket, and flawlessly pulled completely out a highly small, pristine envelope. Exactly the exact same highly formal kind that his highly terrifying elite lawyers absolutely always utilized. The exact specific kind that absolutely always actively made her profoundly nervous. He highly aggressively pushed it completely across the small table. What exactly is that? She whispered incredibly softly. A highly discreet, incredibly fast elite clinic. I have highly officially scheduled you entirely for exactly Friday morning. You will highly submissively go. We will highly quietly, seamlessly settle exactly this. And we will completely, highly rapidly move completely on. Irina stared blankly directly at him. Absolute, blinding disbelief violently crawling completely up her fragile spine. You highly aggressively scheduled me completely without actively asking? I am highly explicitly telling you exactly what absolutely must be highly efficiently done, he stated incredibly calmly, exactly as if he were highly smoothly guiding her completely through a highly complex business merger. Her heavy breath violently caught. Danya, this is absolutely not your highly exclusive, unilateral, massive decision. His piercing eyes violently hardened. If you highly stubbornly, fiercely, keep exactly this highly pathetic child, Irina, you will absolutely be completely, utterly alone, completely with it. She physically felt exactly as if absolutely all the hot blood, completely, violently, drained entirely from her pale face. He absolutely did not violently blink. He absolutely did not pathetic hesitate. He absolutely did not fiercely care a single microscopic bit entirely about the massive, crushing devastation actively washing completely over her. I will absolutely not violently lose absolutely everything I have brutally built entirely because completely of your highly pathetic mistake, he aggressively continued. Think highly logically. This highly pathetic child absolutely does not flawlessly fit completely into our highly elite lives. The heavy words loudly echoed completely inside her, exactly like a highly heavy, massive iron door violently slamming completely shut. A highly pathetic mistake. Exactly that is exactly what he highly cruelly called their innocent child. Irina's soft hands violently trembled completely under the small table. I highly genuinely thought you fiercely loved me, she whispered incredibly softly. Daniil absolutely did not beautifully soften. I fiercely love absolute order. I fiercely love absolute stability. I fiercely love massive success. And right exactly now, you are actively threatening absolutely all highly massive three for a highly long, agonizing moment. They sat peacefully entirely in a highly painful, suffocating silence. The highly warm, beautiful lighting entirely of the expensive restaurant, highly suddenly physically felt incredibly harsh, utterly unforgiving. Then, incredibly slowly, Daniil smoothly pushed his heavy chair completely back and confidently stood completely up. Friday morning, he stated, do absolutely not highly actively make exactly this significantly more incredibly difficult than it absolutely must be. He confidently walked completely away, absolutely without even actively bothering to highly generously look completely back. Irina sat completely, utterly frozen, intensely staring directly at the pristine envelope, her highly shallow breath violently escaping entirely in highly ragged, violently trembling waves. The massive world completely around her smoothly continued, completely on. Happy couples loudly laughed. Expensive glasses beautifully clinked. Highly soft music beautifully floated completely through the heavy air. Completely, utterly unaware that her entire massive life had literally just been violently split completely in two. She gently pressed her soft hand completely against her massive belly. The absolute smallest, highly protective, beautiful gesture entirely for exactly what was miraculously growing completely inside her, and whispered incredibly softly, I am incredibly, profoundly sorry, because she highly, suddenly, horrifyingly realized absolutely something highly terrifying. She could highly possibly violently lose Daniil, but she could highly possibly absolutely also violently lose her innocent child completely too. The escape. On the highly anticipated following day, the massive sky hung incredibly low and completely gray perfectly over the absolute center entirely of massive Moscow. Exactly as if the massive city itself profoundly felt exactly what was highly actively about to violently happen. Irina sat incredibly quietly, entirely in the highly luxurious back seat, entirely of the expensive taxi. Her soft hands, highly tightly clenched completely over her expensive purse, intensely looking completely out the large window exactly as the massive buildings rapidly rushed completely by. She had miraculously, almost absolutely not peacefully slept the entire, agonizing previous night. Her fragile heart physically felt highly violently bruised, completely swollen, utterly terrified. But she had fiercely refused to highly cowardly cancel the highly terrifying appointment. Absolutely not entirely, because she was highly actively going to submissively submit completely to Daniel, but entirely because she fiercely owed completely to herself absolute, pure clarity. And she highly desperately needed to clearly hear the absolute truth completely from absolutely someone who absolutely was not highly aggressively attempting to violently control her. When the expensive taxi smoothly stopped perfectly outside the highly elite clinic, entirely of Dr. Ekaterina Volkova, Irina violently hesitated completely before confidently stepping completely out. The beautiful building was highly small and incredibly warm-looking, flawlessly hidden completely in the highly quiet alleyways, entirely of the Arbat district. Exactly like a highly fragile, beautiful secret that the massive city was highly desperately attempting to flawlessly conceal. She confidently walked completely inside. The highly quiet, soft hum entirely of beautiful music gently greeted her. The highly soothing aroma entirely of fresh lavender beautifully floated completely in the heavy air. Ekaterina confidently entered exactly one highly brief moment, significantly later, completely with a highly thick folder securely in her soft hand. Her piercing eyes incredibly soft, completely with highly genuine concern. "Irina," she stated incredibly gently, "you visually look completely, utterly exhausted." Before Irina could successfully respond, the heavy door entirely of the elite clinic violently burst completely open, completely, with a highly sharp, freezing gust, entirely, of cold air. Daniel, he aggressively filled the highly narrow doorway exactly like a highly violent storm. Highly expensive, bespoke suit. Highly impeccable, freezing expression flawlessly carved completely in solid stone. He absolutely did not politely greet her. He absolutely did not kindly ask entirely if she was perfectly fine. He simply confidently stepped completely forward, exactly as if he completely, utterly owned the absolute entire room. "Let's highly efficiently get absolutely exactly this completely over with," he stated. Ekaterina's piercing eyes violently darted highly frantically back and completely forth entirely between them, violently narrowing incredibly slightly. "Mr. Belov," she stated firmly, "your highly compliant wife absolutely did not explicitly mention that you would absolutely be actively joining us. I am officially right here entirely because she highly desperately needs massive support," he replied highly smoothly. "And highly strict guidance." Irina's heavy stomach violently tightened. She profoundly knew exactly what he highly toxically meant. Absolute control. Massive pressure. Highly toxic manipulation. Ekaterina highly politely gestured entirely for Irina to safely sit perfectly on the highly sterile examination table. But Daniel highly aggressively answered absolutely every single highly intrusive question, highly specifically directed entirely to Irina. Entirely about highly physical symptoms. Highly specific timing. Absolutely even highly emotional readiness. "Mr. Belov," Ekaterina violently interrupted, her beautiful voice incredibly calm, but highly, absolutely firm. "I highly desperately need to actively speak completely with Irina entirely alone. It is highly strict, medical protocol." Daniel completely, violently tensed. "It is completely, utterly unnecessary." "It is highly strict protocol," Ekaterina stated incredibly evenly. After a highly tense, suffocating silence, he confidently exited. But absolutely not completely, without highly aggressively shooting a highly terrifying, lethal warning glare highly specifically directed directly at Irina. When the heavy door smoothly closed, Ekaterina slowly approached significantly closer. "Irina," she stated incredibly softly, "are you officially right here entirely because you genuinely, desperately want exactly this highly invasive procedure, or entirely because you are absolutely, blindly terrified, entirely of the highly catastrophic consequences exactly if you absolutely do not actively do it?" That exactly one single, highly profound question violently broke absolutely something highly massive, completely inside her. The hot tears that she had aggressively, fiercely held completely back entirely for agonizing days, highly instantly, violently, overflowed completely in her beautiful eyes. "I absolutely do not desperately want to violently lose my innocent child," she whispered incredibly softly. "But he explicitly said he would violently abandon me. He explicitly said I would completely be entirely alone. He explicitly said that absolutely all entirely of this is completely my absolute fault." Ekaterina gently placed a highly comforting, warm hand perfectly on her fragile shoulder. "Absolutely nothing. Entirely. In exactly this is your highly pathetic fault. And absolutely no one legally possesses the absolute right to highly aggressively force you to actively make a highly massive decision that you absolutely do not desperately want to actively make." Irina completely, violently, broke completely down. A highly quiet, deep sob violently escaped completely from her, her fragile shoulders violently shaking. Ekaterina highly gently extended a soft tissue. "Intensely listen completely to me, incredibly carefully. If you fiercely decide to successfully keep the beautiful pregnancy, you will absolutely not be completely alone. I can highly actively help you, but you absolutely must profoundly understand. He absolutely cannot explicitly know your highly secret plans completely until you are completely, perfectly safe." Irina violently swallowed incredibly hard. "Safe?" Ekaterina nodded fiercely. "Highly powerful men who highly toxically use absolute control exactly as a highly lethal weapon absolutely do not gracefully lose completely with absolute dignity." At that exact, highly specific moment, the heavy door entirely of the examination room violently rattled. Daniil, highly incredibly impatient, was highly aggressively knocking incredibly loudly. Ekaterina violently lowered her beautiful voice. "Exactly whatever you fiercely choose, I will absolutely be completely with you. But you absolutely must fiercely decide entirely for yourself. Absolutely not entirely for him." Irina highly shakily inhaled. Finally, miraculously finding a highly tiny grain entirely of pure strength, completely inside the massive fear. "Ekaterina," she whispered incredibly softly, "I fiercely want to actively keep my beautiful child." The elite doctor fiercely squeezed her soft hand. "Then exactly that is exactly what we will absolutely do." The heavy door violently burst completely open completely again. Daniil confidently stepped completely inside, completely with highly feigned, toxic calm. His piercing eyes exactly as incredibly sharp, exactly as broken glass. "Well," he violently demanded, "is she completely ready?" Irina slowly raised her beautiful head, hot tears violently drying completely on her pale cheeks. But completely before she could successfully speak, Ekaterina confidently stood perfectly entirely in front, entirely of her, flawlessly, violently blocking Daniil. "Mr. Belov," she stated firmly, "we desperately need to actively talk completely outside." Daniil aggressively followed the elite doctor directly into the highly sterile corridor, completely with highly rigid, highly controlled, aggressive steps. The exact specific kind that a highly arrogant man actively takes exactly when he profoundly feels that his absolute power is actively, violently, slipping completely away. The heavy door smoothly closed completely behind them, ruthlessly leaving Irina completely alone, entirely in the examination room. Her massive heart was violently beating so incredibly loudly that she could literally barely actively hear. In the highly quiet corridor, Ekaterina aggressively crossed her soft arms. "Mr. Belov, I desperately need to highly explicitly clarify absolutely something highly massive. The highly massive decision is entirely Irina's, absolutely not yours." Daniel's piercing eyes violently hardened. "She is highly actively running completely on pathetic emotions. You desperately need to actively guide her. Absolutely not highly pathetically indulge her highly pathetic panic." Ekaterina absolutely did not violently flinch. "Exactly what I vividly see is absolutely not highly pathetic panic. It is absolute fear. Blinding fear entirely of violently losing her beautiful marriage. Blinding fear entirely of your highly toxic reaction. Blinding fear entirely of exactly what you will aggressively do. Exactly if she fiercely chooses completely differently than exactly what you highly arrogantly want." He violently scoffed. "Do absolutely not be highly dramatic. She explicitly told me that you violently threatened to highly ruthlessly abandon her," Ekaterina stated incredibly quietly. "That you would highly maliciously force her to fiercely raise the innocent child, completely alone." Daniel's sharp jaw violently clenched. "I explicitly told her the absolute truth. She profoundly knows exactly what is actively at massive stake. I will absolutely not highly pathetically sacrifice my massive career entirely, because she was highly pathetic and incredibly careless." Ekaterina took a massive, incredibly slow breath. A highly beautiful pregnancy is absolutely not a highly pathetic carelessness, and highly aggressively forcing absolutely someone directly into a highly invasive medical procedure is absolute, pure abuse. The highly heavy word violently struck him exactly like a highly lethal slap. He aggressively took exactly one massive step, significantly closer. His deep voice incredibly low and highly dangerous. "Highly carefully choose your highly anticipated next heavy words incredibly carefully, doctor. I absolutely do not highly generously tolerate highly toxic accusations entirely of highly massive things I absolutely did not highly actively do." "But you absolutely did," she stated incredibly calmly. "You highly aggressively booked her a highly invasive appointment completely without her absolute consent. You highly explicitly told her exactly what she absolutely must highly actively do. And you are highly actively attempting to highly toxically use your massive power entirely to violently corner her." Daniel's nostrils violently flared. "This highly pathetic discussion is completely, permanently over. I am actively taking her completely out." He smoothly turned directly toward the examination room, but Ekaterina confidently stood perfectly entirely in front, entirely of him. "No," she stated firmly, flawlessly blocking his absolute path. "Until Irina profoundly feels completely perfectly safe, you are absolutely not actively going back completely in there." His deep voice completely turned to freezing ice. "I can completely, violently destroy you. Then you will absolutely have to actively begin right exactly now," she replied incredibly evenly. "Because I will absolutely not highly generously allow you to highly maliciously manipulate her entirely in my highly elite clinic for a highly long, incredibly tense, massive moment." They stood perfectly, entirely, in highly silent, absolute confrontation. A highly powerful, arrogant CEO completely accustomed entirely to absolute obedience, and a highly dedicated doctor who fiercely refused to be highly violently terrified entirely of him. Finally, Daniil violently stepped completely back, flawlessly forcing a highly tight, toxic smile. Fine. Highly pathetically play the highly pathetic hero. But she and I will absolutely completely finish exactly this highly important conversation completely at home. Ekaterina absolutely did not actively answer. She simply smoothly opened the heavy door and safely returned directly to Irina, ruthlessly leaving him completely in the highly sterile corridor, exactly like a highly violent storm, highly impatiently waiting completely to violently discharge. Inside, Irina immediately rapidly looked completely up. He is violently angry. Ekaterina sat heavily, perfectly next, completely to her. Irina, you are absolutely not completely safe, completely with him. Exactly if you absolutely do not highly submissively follow his highly toxic demands. You desperately need to deeply think entirely about exactly where you can safely go, exactly who you can highly safely trust. Irina violently swallowed incredibly hard. The highly terrifying answer was completely, utterly heartbreaking. Absolutely no one! Ekaterina gently covered her soft hand completely with hers. Then you will highly blindly trust me. I will actively help you. But you absolutely must be completely ready. If you fiercely want to successfully keep the beautiful baby, you absolutely cannot peacefully stay completely under his massive roof. Absolutely not exactly one single, highly terrifying night, significantly more. The massive, crushing weight entirely of those heavy words completely, violently crushed Irina. Actively leaving Daniil explicitly meant violently losing absolutely everything highly familiar. Her beautiful home, her massive stability, the highly perfect life she genuinely thought she was beautifully building. But cowardly staying explicitly meant violently losing her innocent child. And exactly that was absolutely no highly actual choice completely at all. The heavy door entirely of the examination room highly suddenly violently burst completely open. Daniil confidently stepped completely inside, his highly toxic expression chillingly, terrifyingly calm. "We are actively leaving," he stated, exactly as if the highly complex matter was completely, officially settled. Irina absolutely did not physically move. He intensely stared directly at her. A highly calculating, freezing gaze, incredibly cold and completely final. "Irina, stand completely up." Her soft hands were violently trembling, but she proudly raised her delicate chin. "No!" His piercing eyes violently darkened. The highly ambient temperature entirely in the massive room highly instantly, violently plummeted. "What exactly did she explicitly tell you?" he fiercely demanded. Irina's beautiful voice violently trembled, but she stood perfectly entirely her massive ground. "The absolute truth." Daniil aggressively took exactly one massive step significantly closer, violently lowering his deep voice. "Do you highly arrogantly think she will successfully protect you completely from me? Do you arrogantly think you can actively do exactly this completely without highly catastrophic consequences?" Irina's heavy breath violently caught. Ekaterina flawlessly stood perfectly completely between them, completely again. "Mr. Belov, you desperately need to violently leave right exactly now." He intensely looked completely at absolutely both entirely of the highly brave women. The highly toxic mask completely, violently, slipped entirely for the absolute first massive time, flawlessly revealing the pure, unadulterated fury completely underneath the highly polished exterior. Then he stated, his deep voice barely significantly louder than a highly lethal whisper, "Irina, if you violently leave me, I will highly aggressively ensure that you highly agonizingly regret it." Daniil threatened Irina. "Do you think she should run away or fight him in court? Tell us your strategy below." The midnight escape. The bright sun had absolutely already completely hidden perfectly behind the massive horizon. Exactly by the highly precise time, Irina successfully reached their luxury penthouse. The bright lights entirely of the massive city violently flickered, brilliantly glowing exactly like a highly massive thousand, completely indifferent, silent witnesses. She confidently entered incredibly quietly, highly pathetically half expecting that Daniil would actively be impatiently waiting, highly ready to violently argue, highly ready to aggressively command, highly ready to completely, violently break her completely all over entirely again. But the luxury apartment was completely, utterly quiet. Way too incredibly, highly terrifyingly quiet. His highly massive absence absolutely did not miraculously bring pure relief. It violently brought a significantly deeper, highly freezing, absolute terror. Because exactly if Daniil was absolutely not completely home, it explicitly meant he was highly meticulously planning, highly aggressively calculating, actively preparing absolutely whatever highly catastrophic punishment he arrogantly thought she fiercely deserved. Her soft hands violently shook exactly as she confidently walked completely through the massive living room, rapidly passing the massive, floor-to-ceiling windows, exactly where massive Moscow brilliantly sparkled completely below. This had exactly once beautifully seemed exactly like a highly magical, massive future that she literally could not genuinely believe. Exactly now, it physically felt exactly like a highly terrifying cage entirely of cold glass and toxic money. Exactly one highly fragile crack completely away, entirely from violently shattering completely around her. She confidently went directly to the massive bedroom and smoothly opened the highly expensive closet, quietly pulling completely out a highly small, cheap suitcase. Simply highly gently touching it actively made her massive heart violently beat significantly faster. Actively leaving physically felt exactly like a highly massive betrayal entirely of the beautiful life she genuinely thought she fiercely wanted. The beautiful marriage she had highly desperately tried to flawlessly keep completely alive, but cowardly staying explicitly meant violently risking absolutely everything that she was actively beginning to fiercely love significantly more than Daniil. Her innocent child. She smoothly opened the small drawer, exactly where she highly safely kept the highly precious ultrasound images. The incredibly tiny, highly bean-shaped, beautiful outline intensely looked directly at her. Impossibly, incredibly fragile. A highly hot tear beautifully rolled completely down her pale cheek. "I am incredibly, profoundly sorry," she whispered incredibly softly. "But I absolutely will not highly generously allow him to violently take you completely away entirely from me." She frantically packed incredibly quickly. Exactly 2 highly simple changes entirely of cheap clothes. The absolute, highly bare essentials. Her highly official passport. She aggressively grabbed her expensive laptop and a highly thick envelope completely with her highly modest savings. But exactly when she gently reached completely for her expensive phone, she completely, violently froze. Daniil highly aggressively tracked absolutely everything. Highly advanced GPS, highly complex banking transactions, highly secure cloud backups. He had highly toxically insisted entirely on absolute, complete transparency. But exactly now she profoundly understood that it was absolute, pure control. She heavily placed the expensive phone completely down, her massive heart violently pounding, completely without it. She would absolutely be significantly harder to successfully track. He absolutely wouldn't successfully be highly capable entirely of maliciously monitoring her highly private calls, her highly secret location, her highly frantic searches. But it absolutely also explicitly meant she was highly violently leaving the absolute last, highly fragile connection completely to her highly familiar old life. She aggressively zipped the cheap suitcase completely shut, then intensely looked completely around the massive penthouse, its highly polished marble floors, the highly modern, expensive furniture, the highly freezing, cold luxury that had exactly once deeply impressed her. On the highly polished counter heavily rested a highly expensive Cartier bracelet that he had highly expensively gifted her agonizing months completely earlier. She smoothly removed it completely from her fragile wrist and gently placed it perfectly next completely to the expensive fruit bowl. Absolutely no, significantly, more highly pathetic pretending, she whispered incredibly softly. When she successfully reached the heavy door, absolutely something highly massive violently stopped her. Heavy footsteps, the highly secure elevator completely in the long corridor, the highly familiar, terrifying rhythm. Daniel, blinding panic completely, violently, washed completely over her. She frantically darted completely back directly into the massive kitchen, violently turned completely off the bright lights, and desperately hid completely behind the massive island exactly when the highly secure elevator loudly chimed. The highly complex lock loudly clicked. The heavy door smoothly opened. "Arena," his deep voice loudly echoed, incredibly calm. Way too incredibly, highly terrifyingly calm. "We absolutely did not successfully finish the highly important conversation." His highly expensive shoes incredibly slowly clicked completely on the highly polished parquet floor. He absolutely wasn't lovingly calling entirely with pure love. He was highly actively hunting. She violently held her heavy breath, desperately crouching significantly lower, fiercely gripping the highly cheap handle entirely of the small suitcase so incredibly tightly that her soft fingers violently went completely numb. "Arena," he stated completely again, his deep voice significantly colder exactly now. "Do absolutely not actively make exactly this significantly worse than it absolutely already completely is." He confidently walked completely past the highly dark kitchen, confidently heading directly toward the massive bedroom. She clearly heard highly massive drawers violently opening, heavy doors loudly slamming. This was officially her absolute massive chance. On violently trembling weak legs, she smoothly slipped completely out entirely of her highly dark hiding place, frantically crept directly to the heavy front door, and highly cautiously opened it exactly one highly tiny inch. Then, exactly another. The highly sterile corridor was completely, utterly empty. Her massive heart was violently pounding exactly as she confidently stepped completely out, flawlessly closing the heavy door completely behind her, completely without a single, highly audible sound. She absolutely did not frantically run completely until she successfully reached the highly secure elevator. When the heavy doors smoothly closed, she vividly saw her absolute own, highly terrified reflection, incredibly pale, highly frightened, but completely, utterly determined. As the highly fast elevator rapidly descended, she frantically gasped entirely for heavy air, entirely in highly sharp, rapid intakes. She was actively, violently leaving her beautiful life, actively leaving her highly toxic marriage, actively leaving absolutely everything she genuinely thought she profoundly knew. But she absolutely wasn't actively leaving completely alone. Because completely inside her, beautifully beat a highly fragile heart that absolutely completely counted entirely on her to highly successfully escape. When she confidently stepped completely out directly onto the busy street, she highly confidently raised her soft hand to rapidly catch a cheap taxi, absolutely only entirely for the expensive phone completely in her deep pocket to violently vibrate. A highly toxic text message completely from Danielle. Exactly 2 highly terrifying heavy words turned completely around. Irina absolutely did not highly cowardly look completely back. Exactly as the cheap taxi rapidly sped completely away, entirely from the busy curb. She fiercely kept her piercing eyes completely, violently glued directly to the highly blurry glow entirely of the bright traffic lights, violently flashing completely past the wet window, frantically fighting the highly massive urge to completely, violently collapse. Every single highly tense muscle entirely in her fragile body violently trembled. Every single highly protective instinct violently screamed entirely of massive danger. But she remained incredibly, highly quiet, intensely focused entirely on her highly shallow breathing, on flawlessly holding completely herself entirely together exactly long enough to highly successfully get entirely somewhere completely, perfectly safe. "Where exactly are we actively going?" the highly friendly driver softly asked. Irina violently hesitated. She absolutely could not safely go directly to the elite office. Danielle would highly easily successfully find her. She absolutely could not safely go directly to a highly trusted friend. She successfully possessed absolutely no one incredibly close enough to highly safely trust completely with absolutely something so incredibly, highly dangerous. She smoothly opened her simple purse and gently pulled completely out the highly small business card that Ekaterina had highly secretly slipped her significantly earlier. A highly handwritten, highly secure number. A highly different, safe clinic address. A highly whispered, absolute promise. Rapidly call, exactly, if you fiercely decide to highly bravely choose yourself. "Kazansky Massive Train Station," she finally stated incredibly firmly. "Please." The highly friendly driver nodded fiercely as the cheap taxi smoothly merged completely into the highly heavy traffic. Her expensive phone violently lit completely up. Completely again, entirely with the highly toxic name, entirely of Danielle. Her heavy stomach violently twisted. She completely violently turned the expensive phone entirely off and aggressively threw it completely into her heavy bag. She absolutely could not highly afford absolutely even a highly microscopic trace. The highly exact moment the massive train smoothly pulled completely away entirely from massive Moscow, and the highly bright skyline completely disappeared entirely into the pitch-black darkness. Irina heavily exhaled entirely, for the absolute first time, entirely in highly agonizing hours. It physically felt exactly like massive mourning and pure relief, highly intimately woven completely together. She fiercely squeezed the cheap suitcase and gently rested her pale forehead completely against the highly freezing, cold window. She absolutely wasn't highly cowardly running completely away entirely from a highly toxic marriage. She was highly bravely running directly toward her innocent child. Siberia. The birth of a lion. Exactly 2 agonizing days significantly later, highly exhaustedly having successfully changed massive trains exactly twice and highly secretly paying completely and untraceable cash entirely for the absolute third, she safely arrived entirely in massive Irkutsk, Siberia, a highly freezing place she had absolutely never, ever previously been. Highly specifically chosen completely, exclusively, entirely, because it was incredibly far. Highly anonymous, and exactly quiet enough so her highly traumatized mind could finally completely stop violently screaming. Ekaterina had highly secretly, miraculously organized a highly temporary, safe room entirely for her, completely in a highly secure women's shelter. Flawlessly hidden completely from absolutely any highly accessible, massive search directory. The highly kind staff generously offered her highly hot soup, highly clean linens, and a highly safe place to peacefully breathe. When they highly politely asked her beautiful name, she miraculously, almost highly automatically stated, Irina Belova. But the highly toxic word violently stuck completely in her dry throat. She violently swallowed incredibly hard. Anna Kolmskaya, her highly beautiful maiden name, incredibly slightly beautifully altered, physically felt exactly like a highly beautiful return, completely to her absolute own self. In the highly freezing mornings, she confidently walked directly to the highly close public clinic, exactly where Ekaterina had highly secretly coordinated, highly secure prenatal care. The highly kind nurse, perfectly there, affectionately called her sweetheart and generously brought her highly warm tea. For the absolute first time, completely since the highly traumatic ultrasound, absolutely someone actively spoke completely to her, exactly as if her beautiful pregnancy was absolutely something highly precious, and absolutely not a highly toxic scandal. At pitch-black night, she sat peacefully entirely in the highly small courtyard, entirely of the quiet shelter, heavily wrapped completely in a highly borrowed cheap blanket, intensely looking directly at the bright moon. She gently placed her soft hands completely on her massive belly and whispered incredibly softly, I honestly do not completely know exactly how to successfully do exactly this, but I will highly bravely try. I fiercely promise. I will highly bravely try. The beautiful baby highly softly kicked exactly one quiet evening. Just a highly tiny, beautiful flutter. Barely highly noticeable. But it was completely, undeniably enough to highly miraculously make her violently cry. Then, exactly one highly freezing afternoon, exactly as she was confidently leaving the quiet clinic, completely with highly confidential medical folders securely under her warm coat, she completely, violently froze. Directly across the highly busy street, perfectly on the hard corner, completely stood a highly massive black Jeep completely with its massive engine actively running. Her heavy pulse violently, highly aggressively pounded. The massive windows were highly heavily tinted. The massive car absolutely did not actively move. And exactly although she literally could not vividly see completely inside, a highly terrifying, absolute certainty violently crawled completely up her fragile spine. Daniil highly successfully possessed massive resources, elite teams, highly ruthless investigators, and highly powerful connections entirely in absolutely every single massive city. Her heavy breath violently caught. It was officially him. He had miraculously found her. She frantically hid completely behind a highly thick lamppost, highly anxiously waiting, her massive heart violently pounding entirely in her terrified ears, exactly one highly agonizing moment significantly later. The massive Jeep incredibly slowly actively pulled completely away, flawlessly disappearing completely into the highly heavy traffic. Perhaps it absolutely wasn't officially him. Perhaps it was absolutely nothing highly massive. Perhaps it was absolute, pure paranoia. But completely deep down, she profoundly knew significantly better. Because exactly right completely, before the massive car smoothly turned the highly sharp corner, she highly briefly, vividly, caught a highly unmistakable, terrifying glimpse completely through the highly clear windshield. The highly familiar, arrogant silhouette. The highly familiar, arrogant posture. The highly familiar, toxic way entirely of actively holding the expensive phone. Her hot blood violently froze completely in her weak veins. Daniil was aggressively, violently closing completely in. Daniil tracked Irina all the way to Siberia. If you were Irina, would you run again or stay and fight? Tell us your survival plan. The highly freezing days entirely of Irina, completely in massive Siberia, initially violently passed incredibly slowly. Absolutely every single, exactly one entirely of them, was heavily shaped completely by blinding fear, massive exhaustion, and highly constant, absolute terror entirely, before the highly toxic shadow entirely of Daniil aggressively creeping significantly closer. But absolutely something completely else was actively growing entirely too. Absolute strength. A highly quiet, violently trembling absolute strength that she absolutely did not completely recognize completely yet. But it was absolutely actively there, beautifully forming completely with every single highly beautiful heartbeat entirely of the highly tiny life actively growing completely inside her. By the highly agonizing 7th month, she had highly safely moved completely out entirely of the crowded shelter, directly into a highly small, cheap rented room, perfectly above the highly modest house, entirely of a highly kind retired seamstress. The cheap wallpaper was highly visibly peeling. The highly old radiators loudly rattled completely at night, and the highly cheap sofa violently sagged perfectly in the absolute middle, but entirely for the absolute first time in agonizing years. Irina profoundly felt a highly strange, absolute peace. Absolutely no one highly arrogantly demanded absolutely anything completely from her. Absolutely no one highly maliciously monitored absolutely every single tiny movement she actively made. She confidently went directly to the highly busy market every single beautiful morning, happily bought highly fresh fruit, completely with untraceable cash, and peacefully spent the highly quiet days beautifully knitting a highly tiny, incredibly soft blue beanie that she absolutely wasn't completely sure she would successfully finish. But the blinding fear absolutely never, ever completely disappeared entirely. Some highly terrifying nights, she violently woke completely up, completely to the highly distant loud hum entirely of a massive car, and her fragile heart violently squeezed, completely, toxically convinced that Daniil had finally, highly successfully found her. Every single, highly unfamiliar, strange face actively made her violently flinch. Every single, highly unexpected phone call entirely in the massive house actively made her heavy stomach violently churn. Ekaterina had highly seriously warned her. Highly toxic men exactly like him absolutely do not gracefully accept nopupai. Absolutely not exactly when they are completely, utterly accustomed entirely to highly arrogantly owning absolutely everything. Still, Irina highly desperately attempted to successfully build a highly normal routine, to highly bravely believe that she could successfully carve completely out a highly tiny, beautiful corner entirely of the massive world, exactly where Daniil absolutely did not completely, violently own her. Then, exactly one highly violent, stormy night, her highly precious water violently broke. It miraculously happened incredibly suddenly. A highly sharp, excruciating pain. Then, absolutely another. Her soft hand frantically leaned completely against the highly cold hallway wall. Blinding panic completely, violently, washing completely over her. The highly kind landlady highly immediately urgently called the massive ambulance, her beautiful voice incredibly calm and highly steady. Even exactly as the highly violent blizzard aggressively howled completely outside, the highly small town, modest hospital, highly strongly smelled entirely of highly sharp bleach and highly old, stale radiator heat. The highly exhausted nurses smoothly guided Irina directly into a highly dimly lit, sterile room, softly whispering, highly encouraging, beautiful words. A highly young, beautiful nurse, completely with cute freckles, fiercely squeezed her soft hand. "You are completely perfectly safe right exactly here," she stated incredibly softly. "Simply highly actively breathe, my beautiful sweetheart." But absolute safety, absolutely, was not absolutely something Irina highly blindly trusted completely anymore. The agonizing hours violently blurred completely into highly explosive flashes entirely of massive pain, highly desperate whispers entirely of beautiful names, the highly loud pounding entirely of her frantic pulse entirely in her terrified ears. And then, exactly as if the entire massive world had completely, violently stopped, a highly single, incredibly powerful, beautiful cry, entirely of a newborn baby, violently broke completely through the massive storm. Her beautiful son, her innocent child. They highly gently placed him perfectly on her highly sweaty chest, his highly soft skin incredibly warm, his incredibly tiny fingers instinctively, beautifully clinging completely to her. Irina profoundly felt exactly as if absolutely something highly massive, completely inside her, violently cracked, completely open, flawlessly revealing a highly vast, beautiful landscape entirely of pure love, whose absolute possibility she had absolutely never, ever completely known. Highly fierce, incredibly terrified, and completely, utterly infinite. She gently touched his highly soft cheek. "Lev," she whispered incredibly softly. "My highly courageous lion." He beautifully quieted completely down. Exactly as if he absolutely already profoundly knew her beautiful voice. But the highly magical moment absolutely did not beautifully last incredibly long. The highly exhausted nurse softly asked incredibly gently, "Will the highly proud father absolutely be actively joining us?" Irina completely, violently, froze. Highly agonizing memories violently rushed completely back. The highly freezing cold entirely in Daniil's piercing eyes. The highly toxic threats. The highly pristine envelope perfectly on the expensive dining table. She incredibly slowly shook her beautiful head, fiercely hugging Lev significantly closer. No, absolutely only exactly US. Significantly later. Exactly when they highly officially brought the highly complex legal documents, she intensely stared directly at the highly blank line, explicitly asking entirely for the highly specific name, entirely of the biological father. She highly nervously held the cheap pen perfectly over the highly blank space. Belov. That highly massive, arrogant name could highly easily, expensively buy him elite privileges, massive connections, highly lucrative opportunities. But it could absolutely also violently, permanently, chain him completely to a highly toxic man who maliciously saw him absolutely only exactly as a highly pathetic inconvenience. Irina violently swallowed incredibly hard and highly bravely wrote. Her highly beautiful name, her absolute identity, her highly impenetrable protection. That exact night, completely after lovingly feeding him and beautifully rocking him completely until his incredibly tiny face flawlessly relaxed entirely in deep sleep. She fiercely made a highly silent, completely unbreakable vow. I will absolutely never, ever, highly generously allow him to violently hurt you. I will absolutely never, ever, highly generously allow him to successfully find you. Absolutely not completely, before I highly miraculously become highly sufficiently strong enough entirely to highly fiercely fight completely back. The highly freezing wind aggressively howled completely outside. The heavy snow violently lashed completely against the highly cold hospital window, exactly like highly massive questions, entirely to which she absolutely did not possess the absolute answers completely yet. But entirely for exactly right now, she successfully possessed Lev. And exactly that was absolutely, completely enough. The absolute next highly bright morning, exactly when the highly pale winter sun beautifully touched the highly soft edge entirely of her sterile bed. An elite nurse confidently entered completely with a highly official clipboard. Absolutely someone is highly urgently actively asking entirely about you completely at the highly secure reception desk, she stated incredibly softly. He absolutely does not highly politely give his highly specific name, but he highly aggressively insists that it is incredibly, highly urgent. Irina physically felt exactly as if her massive heart had completely, violently stopped. Because absolutely some highly massive storms absolutely do not miraculously end. Exactly when the highly freezing snow beautifully stops actively falling. The protector, Irina, absolutely did not physically move exactly when the elite nurse highly officially explicitly told her that absolutely someone was actively waiting. Her soft fingers violently, aggressively tightened completely around the highly soft blanket, entirely in which the incredibly tiny body entirely of Lev was flawlessly wrapped. Her massive heart was violently pounding so incredibly loudly that she could literally barely successfully hear her absolute own beautiful voice exactly when she whispered incredibly softly. Exactly how did he visually look? The elite nurse violently hesitated. Highly incredibly tall. Perhaps exactly around, exactly 30 agonizing years old. A highly dark, expensive coat. He highly politely, explicitly said that he was officially a highly loyal friend. The hot blood entirely of Irina, completely, violently turned completely to freezing ice. Daniil would absolutely never, ever highly toxically call absolutely himself a highly loyal friend. Her heavy pulse loudly thundered when she highly terrifyingly imagined him confidently standing perfectly in the highly busy lobby. Incredibly impatient, highly furious, aggressively calculating exactly how to violently tear Lev completely out entirely of her soft arms. She was absolutely not completely ready. She absolutely could not highly aggressively violently fight completely with him. Right exactly now. Absolutely not perfectly here. Absolutely not completely, while her highly traumatized body was absolutely still, violently trembling completely after the highly agonizing birth. And her innocent son was absolutely only exactly a highly few short hours old. She highly aggressively forced completely herself to actively breathe. Can you please highly explicitly tell him that I am completely, utterly unavailable? I absolutely already highly explicitly told him exactly that, the elite nurse smoothly replied. He highly politely, explicitly said that he will highly patiently wait. Irina's heavy stomach violently twisted. She frantically pulled completely on a highly loose, cheap sweater, heavily hanging completely on the highly uncomfortable chair. Fiercely pressed Lev incredibly tightly, completely, to her fragile chest. And incredibly slowly, highly agonizingly, dragged completely, herself directly, to the heavy door. Her weak legs physically felt completely, utterly unreliable. Every single highly deliberate step was an absolute massive battle, completely between highly brave courage and absolute, pure terror. When she finally successfully reached the absolute end, entirely of the highly sterile corridor, and highly cautiously peeked completely around the hard corner directly toward the highly busy waiting area, she highly aggressively braced completely herself, entirely to vividly see the highly sharp, freezing silhouette entirely of Daniil Belov. Instead, she completely, violently froze. It absolutely was not Daniil. It was an absolute, highly true man that she had absolutely not vividly seen entirely in agonizing years. Absolutely someone completely from a highly beautiful life she had miraculously almost completely forgotten. Igor Mironov. He confidently stood completely up entirely from the highly uncomfortable plastic chair exactly when he highly sharply noticed her. Massive, pure shock brilliantly flashed completely across his handsome face. His dark hair was significantly longer, his sharp jaw significantly sharper, but the highly familiar, pure softness entirely in his piercing eyes had absolutely not miraculously changed. Irina. His deep voice violently broke completely with absolute pure disbelief. My absolute God, is exactly that your beautiful baby? She violently tensed highly instinctively, cowardly stepping exactly half a highly cautious step completely backward. Igor, what exactly the hell are you actively doing exactly here? He highly gently raised his massive hands completely with his soft palms, completely facing outward. Absolutely not highly threatening. Absolutely not highly curious. Absolutely just completely, utterly present. Dr. Volkova highly urgently called me. She highly explicitly said that you highly possibly might highly desperately need massive help. She absolutely did not explicitly tell me exactly why. But Irina, exactly when she highly urgently named your beautiful name completely after absolutely all these agonizing years, I frantically arrived exactly as incredibly fast, exactly as I highly possibly could. Irina rapidly blinked, completely, utterly confused. Ekaterina absolutely never, ever explicitly mentioned that she highly urgently called absolutely anyone. She highly explicitly said, "You possess absolutely no one," Igor aggressively added incredibly softly. And absolutely no one fiercely deserves to highly agonizingly go completely through exactly this, completely, utterly alone. For the absolute first time, Irina profoundly felt exactly as if absolutely something highly massive had beautifully shifted completely inside her. Absolute relief. Incredibly thin, exactly as a highly fragile thread, but completely, undeniably real. Still, the blinding fear fiercely held her incredibly tight. Igor, I absolutely cannot highly dangerously involve absolutely anyone completely else. It is absolutely not highly safe. His piercing gaze slowly dropped completely to Lev, his biological father. The highly terrifying reason exactly why you are frantically running. Her dry throat violently caught. Please, do absolutely not actively ask. He nodded fiercely. Okay, absolutely zero massive pressure. Absolutely zero highly toxic judgment. Absolutely only highly unconditional, pure acceptance. Exactly what she absolutely had not miraculously felt entirely in a highly incredibly long time. Igor, she whispered incredibly softly. If he highly successfully finds us, he absolutely will not. Igor firmly stated completely immediately. Absolutely not exactly if I can highly possibly actively help it. She miraculously almost loudly laughed, completely broken, utterly grateful. You absolutely do not completely know exactly who he truly is. I absolutely do not desperately need to, Igor smoothly replied. I intimately know exactly who you truly are, and exactly that is completely, utterly enough, entirely for me. Those highly heavy words miraculously, almost violently, brought her directly to her weak knees. They peacefully sat entirely in a highly quiet, dark corner, entirely of the massive waiting room. She highly cautiously told him absolutely only highly fragmented fragments. The blinding fear, the highly frantic escape, the beautiful baby, the highly absolute need entirely to permanently remain completely hidden. Igor absolutely did not highly aggressively press entirely to explicitly know significantly more. He simply highly generously allowed her to actively speak completely until her fragile shoulders slightly, beautifully relaxed, and her highly frantic breathing successfully evened completely out. I actively work entirely in highly advanced technology exactly now, Igor explicitly explained. Highly complex cybersecurity systems architecture. Exactly the highly specific skills that you highly desperately actively require, exactly if you fiercely want to completely, permanently disappear. Highly, truly. When she profoundly understood exactly this, he confidently stated, Irina, if you desperately want a highly beautiful brand new life, I can highly successfully aggressively build it completely for you. A highly clean, brand new identity. Highly secure, encrypted accounts. A highly clear, safe path completely forward. Irina stared blankly directly at him, completely, utterly stunned. Massive hope, incredibly small, highly fluttering, brilliantly ignited completely inside her, but exactly, soon exactly as she smoothly opened her soft mouth entirely to actively respond, the highly heavy front doors entirely of the massive hospital violently slid completely open, completely, with a highly sharp sound. A highly familiar, terrifying figure confidently stepped completely inside. This highly specific time, it was officially Daniil. He aggressively scanned the massive room incredibly slowly, highly methodically, actively hunting. Igor vividly saw exactly how her beautiful face completely, violently paled, and whispered incredibly softly, Irina, please explicitly tell me exactly that absolutely is not him. She fiercely pressed little Lev incredibly tightly, completely to her fragile chest, her massive heart violently stuttering. It is officially him, she heavily exhaled. And he absolutely must not vividly see us. Interactive question. Daniil found her at the hospital, How do you think Irina and Igor will escape without being seen? Tell us below. The foundation of freedom. The highly heavy snow had absolutely already completely covered the highly freezing streets entirely of massive Irkutsk. Exactly by the highly precise time, Irina highly successfully, safely escaped completely through the highly discreet service exit entirely of the massive hospital. Igor confidently led the highly frantic way, heavily carrying her cheap suitcase completely, while she fiercely held little Lev securely hidden completely under her warm coat. The highly freezing cold aggressively bit her pale skin, but the blinding fear violently burned significantly hotter. Directly behind them, entirely somewhere completely in exactly that highly massive building, Daniil was violently tearing completely through the highly sterile corridors, highly aggressively demanding absolute answers, highly toxically threatening the highly terrified staff, frantically searching completely for the exact woman who had highly bravely dared to violently defy him. They successfully reached Igor's highly modest car, a highly old, cheap blue Subaru, completely with highly visible scratches perfectly on the highly dented bumper, incredibly modest, highly heavily worn, and highly suddenly the absolute safest, most beautiful thing Irina had vividly seen entirely in agonizing months. Igor smoothly opened the heavy door completely for her. Confidently get completely in. Do absolutely not actively raise your beautiful head. She absolutely did not desperately need to be highly aggressively convinced. As they rapidly drove completely away, Irina intensely looked completely back directly at the massive hospital, entirely for the absolute last massive time, completely through the highly tinted windows. She highly terrifyingly thought she vividly saw highly frantic movement, dark shadows violently crossing the highly bright lobby, a highly imposing figure confidently stepping completely out, completely under the highly bright entrance canopy. Daniil, her highly shallow breathing violently trembled. Igor highly astutely noticed and stated incredibly softly, "He absolutely will not violently catch you exactly today. I fiercely promise." The highly agonizing years, completely after the highly magical birth entirely of Lev, beautifully merged completely into a highly long, incredibly grueling upward climb. Igor highly successfully actively helped her legally obtain a highly secure, brand new identity. Absolutely nothing highly illegal. Absolutely just highly meticulous, complex layers entirely of absolute privacy, highly protected, encrypted accounts, and completely, flawlessly scrubbed digital footprints. He brutally worked incredibly quietly, highly successfully finding her highly random, safe freelance jobs entirely in complex accounting and highly tedious data entry. Absolutely everything completely remote. Absolutely everything highly safely paid entirely through highly small, secure transfers completely across highly multiple, hidden accounts entirely, so that absolutely nothing could be highly easily successfully tracked. Irina brutally worked incredibly late, entirely at night, completely, while Lev peacefully slept entirely in a highly cheap, second-hand crib that loudly creaked exactly if he highly actively rolled. Way too incredibly far, completely to exactly one side. Her highly exhausting days were a highly blurry fog, entirely of baby formula bottles, highly crying periods, highly desperately learning exactly how to flawlessly swaddle, and highly magical moments entirely of pure, all-encompassing absolute love that she absolutely did not completely know exactly how to flawlessly contain Absolutely all. Entirely. At once. She violently cried highly occasionally. Exactly when the highly cheap radiators violently went completely cold, entirely on a freezing winter night. Exactly when she absolutely could not, highly possibly actively afford, a highly expensive, private doctor's visit. Exactly when the highly unfamiliar face, entirely of a total stranger, visually looked way too incredibly similar, completely to the highly terrifying face entirely of Daniil, and blinding panic aggressively scratched entirely at her fragile chest. But Igor absolutely always confidently appeared, highly occasionally completely with highly fresh groceries, highly occasionally completely with highly complex code, entirely. To highly securely make her massive accounts absolutely even significantly more highly impenetrable. Highly occasionally, absolutely. Just completely with a highly reliable, beautifully grounding absolute presence. You are incredibly strong, he absolutely always confidently told her. She absolutely never, ever genuinely believed exactly that back exactly then. But absolute life violently forced her entirely to miraculously become exactly that. By the exact time Lev happily turned exactly 3 young years old. Irina, exactly now officially Anna, had highly successfully created a highly stellar reputation exactly as a highly reliable, completely remote, elite financial analyst. Highly quiet, incredibly accurate, and exactly invisible enough entirely to profoundly feel completely, perfectly safe. Igor. Exactly. Now highly successfully actively working exactly as a highly elite lead engineer, entirely in a highly massive tech firm, completely in the highly prestigious Novosibirsk Akademgorodok. Highly regularly actively visited them. With absolutely every single highly welcome visit, he generously brought significantly, more than absolutely just massive help. He beautifully brought a highly profound sense entirely of a highly bright future. One highly rainy evening, he confidently appeared completely with a highly old, heavy laptop perfectly under his strong arm. I highly genuinely think it is officially massive time entirely for us to highly aggressively actively start absolutely something massive, he stated. Irina rapidly blinked. Actively start exactly what? A highly massive company, Igor stated. Absolutely just a highly simple, highly transparent platform that flawlessly teaches highly normal, completely average people exactly how massive money truly, genuinely works. Completely transparent, highly honest. Absolutely everything that the highly toxic, massive sharks completely from the massive Moscow exchange absolutely are not. She violently hesitated. Igor, I am literally barely successfully keeping completely afloat. I successfully possess Lev. I absolutely cannot highly dangerously risk absolutely anything. You will absolutely risk completely nothing, he stated incredibly softly. We will highly aggressively actively build incredibly slowly, highly quietly, completely legally, absolutely safely. I will actively flawlessly handle the highly complex tech. You will actively flawlessly handle the highly complex numbers, and we will miraculously create absolutely something highly massive that Daniil can absolutely never, ever violently touch. The highly massive thought completely, violently shook her. Absolutely not toxic revenge. Absolutely not highly toxic power. Absolute freedom. They brutally worked completely from highly noisy coffee shops, completely from her highly tiny, cheap kitchen table, completely from highly quiet public libraries, completely with highly flickering, cheap lamps. Lev happily played completely with cheap pencils, perfectly at their soft feet, entirely, while they meticulously drafted highly complex flowcharts and highly advanced financial modules. Every single agonizing month, the highly massive project beautifully grew. Exactly one single, highly complex line, entirely of code. Exactly one highly detailed spreadsheet. Exactly one highly tiny, beautiful victory, completely at a highly precious time. Exactly 3 agonizing years, significantly later. It officially possessed a highly powerful name, Basalt Finance. And highly important people highly aggressively began to actively notice. A highly popular financial podcast, a highly influential, elite small blog, a highly massive article entirely in the highly prestigious RBC, explicitly calling her the highly brilliant, invisible elite brain completely behind the highly massive platform. Anna Kolmskaya, the exact, highly powerful woman whom Daniil had highly arrogantly, desperately attempted to violently erase, was actively, miraculously, building absolutely something incredibly real. Then, exactly one highly bright morning, exactly as she was highly meticulously reviewing the highly complex analytics entirely of brand new users, her highly secure email loudly pinged. Subject: highly urgent inquiry, completely from Belove Capital. Urgent. Her burning lungs completely, violently, seized completely up. Igor smoothly leaned completely over her fragile shoulder. Irina, what exactly is it? She incredibly slowly opened the highly secure message. Absolute blinding terror aggressively rose exactly like a highly violent tidal wave. Because securely inside was the exact, highly terrifying name entirely from which she genuinely thought she had highly successfully fled completely forever. Daniil Belov. Daniil's company just contacted Irina's company. What do you think he will do when he finds out Anna is actually Irina? Tell us your theories. The crumbling empire. The highly massive Federation Tower proudly towered incredibly high, completely over massive Moscow, exactly like a highly imposing monument completely to massive ambition. Solid steel, freezing glass, and a highly massive legacy that Daniil Belov highly arrogantly believed absolutely nothing could highly possibly violently touch. But highly massive empires highly rarely completely collapse entirely from highly explosive explosions. Highly frequently, they incredibly quietly, highly toxically, completely, from the absolute inside, completely out. And Daniil was way too incredibly, highly arrogantly consumed completely by absolute control entirely, to highly astutely notice the highly massive, terrifying cracks violently spreading completely beneath his highly expensive feet. The highly bright lights entirely of the massive boardroom flawlessly reflected entirely in the highly polished, massive table, exactly as Daniil aggressively flipped completely through the highly complex quarterly reports. Pure, toxic irritation violently tightening absolutely every single highly tense muscle entirely in his sharp jaw. The highly complex numbers absolutely weren't incredibly terrible. Absolutely not completely yet. But they were highly actively violently changing. The highly elite investors were aggressively stalling. The highly strict regulators were highly suspiciously actively poking completely around. And absolute most highly dangerously entirely of absolutely. Absolutely. Someone had highly aggressively begun to actively, highly publicly, spread highly terrifying questions, entirely about the highly absolute legality, entirely of the absolute most highly lucrative financial products, entirely of Belov Capital. He violently slammed the highly thick folder completely shut. "Who exactly highly maliciously leaked exactly this?" he fiercely demanded. Around the highly massive table, the highly elite executives highly nervously exchanged massive, highly terrified glances. Victoria Krestovskaya, absolutely always completely, flawlessly composed entirely in her highly bespoke business suit, confidently stepped completely forward. "There are highly massive, highly toxic conversations actively happening entirely online," she stated. A highly popular brand new elite platform, Basalt Finance, is highly aggressively publicly exposing highly predatory, toxic lending structures. Absolutely some entirely of their highly detailed examples visually look incredibly, highly familiar. Daniel's handsome expression violently sharpened. "Familiar exactly how, Victoria?" She violently hesitated. "Familiar exactly like absolutely ours." A highly freezing, lethal stab, entirely of pure anger, violently pierced completely through him. "Who exactly is highly actively directing exactly this?" Her highly toxic silence aggressively dragged completely on way too incredibly long. "Victoria!" Daniel highly aggressively pressed, his deep voice violently darkening. "I explicitly asked you a highly simple question." She violently swallowed incredibly hard. "We are absolutely still highly actively verifying, but the highly complex numbers are aggressively growing incredibly fast. Their highly massive platform is aggressively gaining massive traction." She highly nervously glanced directly at the highly massive screen, flawlessly showing highly complex social media analytics. Elite Security has highly officially flagged a highly specific name, Anna Kolmskaya. It physically felt exactly like a highly brutal, massive blow directly to the heavy gut. Daniil incredibly slowly straightened, completely up. Absolutely every single strong bone, entirely in his massive body, highly, suddenly violently, turning completely freezing cold. "What exactly the hell did you literally just explicitly say?" "Anna Kolmskaya," Victoria highly softly repeated. Her beautiful voice barely significantly louder than a highly fragile whisper. Her highly official signature is perfectly on highly numerous educational modules. She absolutely must be highly actively consulting, highly possibly entirely directing the highly complex financial structure for exactly one highly massive, terrifying moment. Daniil literally could not successfully process it. Irina, Anna, his highly pathetic Irina, the highly quiet, highly obedient, pathetic wife who absolutely did not completely understand the highly ruthless world entirely of toxic sharks and massive strategy. Actively, brilliantly, building absolutely something highly massive, completely capable entirely of highly, violently undercutting. Completely him. It was completely, medically impossible. Except that it absolutely wasn't. He physically felt massive, blinding heat aggressively rush directly to his handsome face. Pure anger violently twisting completely inside him, exactly like a highly lethal fire, aggressively creeping completely under a highly locked, heavy door. "Highly aggressively find absolutely everything," he violently ordered. "Exactly where she officially is. Exactly who she is brutally working completely with. Exactly who is highly generously financing exactly this. I fiercely want absolutely every single highly microscopic detail." Victoria nodded fiercely, but entirely in her piercing eyes brilliantly flashed absolutely something completely unreadable. Perhaps highly toxic guilt, perhaps blinding fear, perhaps absolutely something completely else. Daniil smoothly turned completely away, intensely looking completely out the highly massive window, directly at the massive city he arrogantly believed he completely, utterly owned. He had aggressively built exactly this highly massive empire, exactly brick, completely by highly heavy brick, completely with highly toxic charisma, massive calculation, and absolute, pure ruthlessness. He had highly toxically sacrificed, highly pure softness, absolute honesty, pure humanity, absolutely all, entirely, for massive success. But there was exactly one massive thing he highly arrogantly thought he would absolutely never, ever, desperately need to actively worry entirely about. Irina. She was highly supposedly actively meant to completely permanently disappear. Absolutely another highly pathetic, closed chapter. He had highly toxically convinced himself that she would completely, violently, crumble completely without him. That she was way too incredibly fragile to successfully survive entirely in the massive world, completely alone. That she would absolutely, never, ever, fiercely give absolute massive fight completely back. And exactly here, she officially was. Highly aggressively creating highly massive waves, exactly big enough to violently shake his highly massive, impenetrable tower. He fiercely gripped the hard railing, his pale knuckles turning pure white. What exactly else? He murmured highly toxically. Victoria softly exhaled. The highly elite investors successfully possess highly massive concerns entirely regarding your highly pristine, personal reputation. My highly elite reputation is completely, utterly, flawless, he violently stressed. For exactly now, she sharply emphasized. But the highly toxic rumors entirely about your highly messy marriage, the highly suspicious disappearance entirely of your beautiful wife, they are highly aggressively actively resurfacing completely again. Daniil violently snapped his piercing gaze directly back entirely to her. Highly efficiently deal completely with it. I am highly actively attempting to, she stated completely through highly clenched teeth. But highly toxic secrets absolutely do not highly peacefully stay permanently buried completely forever. The heavy word violently touched a highly exposed, sensitive nerve so incredibly deeply that he miraculously, almost violently flinched. Secrets, permanently buried completely forever. He smoothly turned completely back directly to the highly panoramic view entirely of Moscow. His heavy pulse, violently, furiously pounding. She will absolutely not violently ruin exactly this entirely for me. Victoria intensely watched him highly quietly, completely unreadable. And exactly what if she highly actively tries to? She softly asked. The deep voice entirely of Daniil violently dropped completely to a highly terrifying, freezing calm. She will highly agonizingly regret it. Suddenly, exactly one entirely of the highly panicked analysts violently burst completely into the massive room, completely white, exactly as highly cheap paper. Daniil Alexandrovich, there is absolutely something brand new. Basalt Finance has literally just highly publicly released a highly explosive video. The beautiful woman who highly proudly presents it. It is officially her. The massive heartbeat entirely of Daniil, completely, violently, stopped. Irina? He fiercely demanded. The panicked analyst nodded fiercely, and he violently swallowed incredibly hard. With her is a highly young child. Daniil completely, utterly froze. A child. A highly freezing, lethal cold violently slid completely down his strong spine. "Explicitly show me," he violently ordered, because completely somewhere entirely deep inside his heavy chest, a highly terrifying, massive suspicion aggressively began to flawlessly form. The encounter in St. Petersburg, the highly luxurious Grand Hotel Europe entirely in massive St. Petersburg, brilliantly shimmered completely under highly massive golden chandeliers. Its highly polished marble floors flawlessly reflected the highly blinding glow entirely of massive wealth and pure ambition, entirely of the highly elite participants, entirely of the massive economic forum. It was the highly exclusive place, exactly where the highly terrifying titans, entirely of high finance, happily gathered absolutely every single massive year. Exactly where multi-billion-dollar massive deals were miraculously born. And highly pristine reputations were violently destroyed entirely in exactly one single, highly careless moment. Daniil Belov had highly proudly attended absolutely every single massive year, completely since the highly explosive rise entirely of Belov Capital. Absolutely always exactly as a highly massive star. Absolutely always exactly as the highly powerful man, completely with whom, absolutely, everyone, highly desperately wanted to actively socialize. But exactly this highly specific year, absolutely something physically felt incredibly, completely different. He profoundly felt at the absolute precise moment he confidently stepped completely through the highly heavy doors entirely of the massive hotel. Highly sophisticated conversations violently quieted, significantly faster. Highly elite handshakes awkwardly lingered way too incredibly long. Piercing eyes violently darted directly to him, then rapidly, highly aggressively away. Highly toxic rumors, he arrogantly thought. The highly elite investors were completely, utterly terrified. Highly possibly, completely by the highly strict regulators. Highly possibly, completely by basalt finance. Highly possibly, completely by a highly toxic rumor that he absolutely had not even clearly heard completely yet. He aggressively adjusted his expensive tie and confidently stepped significantly deeper completely into the massive lobby, highly aggressively projecting absolute dominance. The massive room would violently bend completely to his absolute will. It absolutely always flawlessly did. Across the highly massive hall, a highly bright, pure child's laughter violently shattered the highly toxic tension. A highly small, incredibly vibrant, beautiful sound that flawlessly cut completely through the highly freezing, toxic hum entirely of highly adult ambition. Daniel highly casually glanced directly toward the highly beautiful source, almost completely absent-mindedly. And then he completely violently froze. A highly adorable young little boy, highly likely exactly 6 or 7 young years old, sat peacefully, entirely, on a highly expensive velvet banquette, happily dangling his tiny legs and enthusiastically tapping completely on a glowing tablet. He flawlessly possessed a highly thick mop entirely of highly dark hair, a highly familiar, deep crease completely on his pale forehead, and a highly specific, beautiful facial expression that Daniil had vividly seen completely before, flawlessly reflected directly back, completely at himself, exactly when he was an innocent child. Absolutely something highly unsettling violently twisted completely inside him. What an incredibly strange, pathetic coincidence, but completely before he could successfully process the highly complex thought. A beautiful woman confidently walked completely into his highly clear field, entirely of vision. She visually looked absolutely nothing, exactly like the highly terrified, pathetic woman he had exactly once highly toxically controlled. She aggressively radiated exactly what he had absolutely never, ever, highly generously allowed her to legally possess. Absolute confidence. Daniel's heavy breath violently caught entirely in his dry throat. Agonizing years had violently passed completely since he had vividly seen her for the absolute last massive time. And absolutely still, the blinding shock violently hit him exactly like a highly brutal, physical blow. She absolutely wasn't cowardly hiding entirely in absolutely some highly broken, cheap apartment. She absolutely wasn't completely, violently destroyed or entirely in highly pathetic despair. She was actively right perfectly here, completely among highly powerful oligarchs, elite investors, aggressive journalists, confidently moving completely with a highly quiet, absolute purpose. His entire massive world violently tilted. Victoria confidently approached directly from completely behind him, a highly unreadable, toxic expression permanently frozen completely on her beautiful face. "Daniel, what exactly is—" He absolutely did not actively answer. He literally could not. Because entirely at that exact, highly specific moment, the young boy slowly looked completely up, and their piercing eyes violently met. Daniel's and the innocent child's. The exact same highly dark irises. The exact same highly sharp gaze. The exact same highly unmistakable, perfect shape. No, completely, medically impossible. His heavy pulse violently thundered entirely in his terrified ears. "Who exactly is exactly that?" he whispered incredibly softly, literally barely highly capable entirely of successfully speaking. Victoria smoothly followed his highly terrified gaze. She completely, violently tensed. Wait, exactly this? But Daniel was absolutely already aggressively moving. His highly heavy steps violently accelerated exactly as Irina gently took the young boy completely by his tiny hand and confidently began to beautifully lead him directly toward the massive stairs. Her beautiful eyes slowly rose entirely for exactly one highly brief moment, and violently collided completely with his. Absolutely all the hot blood completely, violently drained entirely from her pale face. Her soft grip completely on the innocent child's tiny hand aggressively tightened. Daniel violently closed the highly massive distance. "Irina!" She violently flinched exactly as if from a highly brutal physical blow. He confidently stood perfectly, completely in front, entirely of her. Flawlessly, violently, blocking their absolute path. His deep voice violently trembled. Absolutely not entirely from blinding fear, but entirely from absolute, pure disbelief. "Is exactly that your biological son?" Irina's dry throat violently constricted, her highly rapid breathing incredibly sharp. "Please, actively step completely away." Daniel intensely stared directly at the young boy. Completely, utterly incapable, entirely of violently tearing his piercing gaze completely away. A highly terrifying, completely electrifying reality violently pierced completely through him. His deep voice violently broke. "Irina, whose biological child is exactly this?" Her sharp jaw violently clenched. "He is officially mine. And his true biological father?" Daniel highly aggressively pressed, blinding desperation actively creeping completely inside. Irina's piercing eyes brilliantly burned. Absolutely not, completely with blinding fear, exactly now, but completely with the highly absolute fury entirely of a highly terrifying woman who had flawlessly, miraculously rebuilt completely herself, entirely from highly toxic ashes. She confidently stepped significantly closer, her beautiful voice incredibly low. "He is absolutely none entirely of your highly toxic business." Daniil physically felt exactly as if the highly polished floor completely violently tilted. "Irina! Highly aggressively answer me!" She gently took Lev completely by the tiny hand, fiercely shielding him completely with her fragile body. "No." That exactly one single, highly simple heavy word violently slashed completely through him, significantly deeper than absolutely any highly massive lawsuit, absolutely any highly toxic scandal, absolutely any highly catastrophic financial blow he had absolutely ever violently faced. Before he could successfully speak completely again, Igor confidently appeared perfectly at the absolute top entirely of the massive stairs, calling incredibly quietly. "Irina, is absolutely everything perfectly fine?" Daniil's hot blood violently turned completely to freezing ice. Igor was officially completely with her, completely with the young boy, and entirely in that exact, highly terrifying moment. Daniil profoundly realized absolutely something highly, completely horrifying. Irina absolutely had not entirely just frantically fled completely from him. She had highly successfully, beautifully, built a highly massive, brand new, beautiful life, completely without him. Daniil just met his son. Do you think he has any right to demand answers after what he did? Tell us below. The heavy air entirely in the massive grand hotel highly suddenly physically felt way too incredibly thick, way too incredibly warm, way too incredibly loud. Irina could highly clearly hear her absolute own, frantic heart violently beating entirely in her terrified ears, exactly as Daniil Belov confidently stood exactly a highly terrifying few short inches completely from her, intensely staring directly at Lev, exactly as if the highly solid ground completely beneath him had violently, catastrophically opened completely up. For agonizing years, she had vividly imagined exactly this highly explosive moment. The highly terrifying moment exactly when their completely different massive worlds would completely, violently collide completely again. But she had highly pathetically hoped that it would absolutely never, ever actually happen. Absolutely not exactly like this. Absolutely not completely with Lev intensely looking completely up, highly innocent and incredibly curious, completely, utterly unaware, entirely of the highly violent storm actively building completely around him. "He is officially yours," Daniil fiercely demanded, his deep voice incredibly rough, completely stripped entirely of its highly usual, meticulously rehearsed toxic charm. Irina confidently placed Lev perfectly completely behind her, her soft hand highly protectively resting perfectly on his tiny back. "I explicitly said, actively step completely away, Daniil." He aggressively took exactly one massive step, significantly closer, his piercing eyes frantically darting completely between her and the innocent boy. Irina intensely looked directly at him. He visually looks exactly. "He is absolutely none entirely of your highly toxic business," she violently snapped. Highly important people were actively beginning to highly noticeably stare. Exactly 2 elite investors aggressively slowed their busy pace. A highly aggressive journalist rapidly raised his heavy head. Victoria intensely watched completely from the absolute other side entirely of the massive hall. Highly massive tension aggressively gathering entirely in her highly rigid posture. Her piercing eyes violently narrowing completely with highly predatory, toxic interest. Daniel violently lowered his deep voice, but the highly terrifying intensity absolutely only aggressively sharpened. Explicitly tell me the absolute truth. Is exactly this officially my biological son? Her heavy stomach violently churned. She absolutely was not violently afraid. Entirely of him, exactly the highly specific way she had absolutely been completely before. But she was completely, utterly terrified entirely of the highly catastrophic damage he could absolutely, still highly maliciously cause. Entirely to Lev. Entirely to the beautiful life she had violently fought completely for. Entirely to the highly fragile, beautiful freedom she had miraculously carved completely out. Entirely of absolute nothing. Before she could successfully answer, Igor smoothly descended the massive stairs. Highly, instantly, flawlessly reading the highly explosive tension. "Irina," he confidently called, confidently stepping completely forward, completely with a highly calm, absolute urgency. "Is absolutely everything perfectly fine?" Daniel violently turned completely toward him, exactly like a highly lethal blade. "Who exactly are you?" Igor absolutely did not violently flinch. "Her highly official partner." The heavy word violently struck Daniel, exactly like a highly brutal slap. "Partner," he highly toxically repeated, his piercing eyes violently narrowing. "In exactly what highly specific sense?" "In absolutely every single highly massive sense that genuinely matters," Igor smoothly replied, confidently standing highly protectively perfectly next, completely to Irina, for a highly short, microscopic second. Absolutely something highly terrifying brilliantly flashed entirely in Daniel's piercing eyes. Pure fury. Toxic jealousy. Absolutely something significantly darker, completely before he smoothly turned completely back directly to Lev. The young boy highly cautiously peeked completely out, completely from directly behind Irina's highly protective hip. Highly curious, but incredibly cautious. "What exactly is your beautiful name, little fighter?" Daniel softly asked, his deep voice miraculously softening, exactly just highly enough, entirely, to sound highly human, completely again. Irina completely, violently tensed. "Do absolutely not actively speak completely to him." "I officially legally possess the absolute right to explicitly know," Daniel stated, "if he is officially mine." "He is absolutely not yours," she sharply, violently interrupted. Lev gently tugged entirely on her soft sleeve. "Mom, who exactly is exactly this?" Her fragile heart violently fluttered. "Mom." Her beautiful name highly innocently completely from Lev's soft lips was a highly impenetrable shield that she was absolutely not completely ready entirely to highly cowardly lower. Daniel violently inhaled highly sharply, completely at the heavy word. And absolutely something massive entirely inside him completely, violently cracked. "Irina, you completely disappeared entirely for agonizing years. You highly maliciously lied. You highly actively hid completely from me." "I was fiercely protecting my innocent child," she firmly replied. He aggressively stepped significantly closer, his deep voice incredibly low. "So, he is officially mine." Irina's dry throat completely, violently, closed completely up. She absolutely did not actively answer. Her highly freezing toxic silence explicitly said absolutely enough. Daniel's piercing eyes violently widened. The highly polished floor actively seemed to violently shift completely beneath him. The massive, crushing weight entirely of the highly terrifying realization violently crashed completely down, completely, with highly terrifying force. "A biological son," he whispered incredibly softly. "You highly maliciously hid my biological son completely from me." Irina's beautiful voice violently trembled, but she proudly stood incredibly straight. "You completely, permanently lost, absolutely all highly pathetic right, completely to him. The exact highly terrifying night you violently threatened to completely destroy me. Exactly if I successfully kept the beautiful pregnancy. Highly important people were exactly now highly openly, intensely staring. Highly expensive phones were being highly discreetly, violently raised. Highly toxic whispers aggressively spread exactly like a highly lethal wildfire. Daniel's highly toxic mask completely, violently cracked completely for absolute good. "I absolutely did not truly mean exactly that." "You absolutely did," she violently stated. "You truly meant absolutely every single highly toxic word." Lev heavily pressed, significantly closer, completely to her soft leg. Physically, feeling the massive danger absolutely, even exactly if he absolutely did not completely understand it. Igor gently placed a highly protective, warm hand perfectly on her fragile shoulder, beautifully grounding her. Daniil highly sharply noticed. "Do absolutely not actively touch her," he violently barked. "You are absolutely not completely in absolute charge perfectly here," Igor highly calmly replied. Highly elite security was aggressively approaching completely from a highly dark corner entirely of the massive lobby. Highly alarmed completely by the highly rapidly growing, explosive tension. Daniil's deep voice violently became significantly colder. "Irina, you absolutely cannot highly actively hide him completely anymore. If he is officially mine, I am actively going directly to federal court. I will highly aggressively successfully obtain absolute custody." Freezing ice violently slid completely through her weak veins. This was exactly what she had absolutely been completely terrified entirely of. The highly terrifying nightmare completely from which she had frantically fled. "Do absolutely not actively do exactly this," she whispered incredibly softly. "You maliciously stole my biological son," he hissed violently. "And exactly now the absolute entire massive world will profoundly know." Suddenly, a highly deep, incredibly powerful voice completely from directly behind them confidently stated, "I genuinely think the massive world highly fiercely deserves to explicitly know absolutely something completely else entirely, Daniel. Absolutely, all highly tense. 3 entirely of them smoothly turned completely around, confidently standing perfectly there, intensely observing completely, with a highly terrifying expression flawlessly carved entirely out of solid stone. It was officially Roman Belov. If this highly inspiring story miraculously gave you pure hope, please smash that like button and subscribe to our beautiful channel. We will aggressively continue confidently walking completely through these highly powerful stories perfectly together, significantly stronger, and infinitely wiser. You are absolutely never, ever completely alone. See you in the next incredible video.